Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. Joining me today is author Thomas Beckett Kane of the book The Reckoning about COVID and the response to it. I don't think you and I agree completely on that response, but it's been the 5 years. No one seems to agree on what had happened. We don't seem to have a sort of shared reality of that. So I'm interested. And I want to interrupt. I just want to get your sense of what you think happened, and then I'll sort of kind of ask some questions from my perspective. But looking back at 2020, what do you think occurred, and how would you sum that up, and how that's addressed in your book?
Sure, Stephen. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, I think that 2020, as you said, there's really not a common understanding of what happened. If anything, it's been a deliberate sort of scrubbing of the record in many ways about trying to forget what happened and just kind of sweep it all under the rug on both sides, right? And so, it's troublesome, right? Because if you want to talk about COVID, if you want to talk about the virus, I think if you're skeptical of the response that did happen, say the lockdowns, full disclosure, I was critical of the lockdowns in my book. You sort of get lumped into the category of, oh, well, you don't think COVID is real. You don't think it was a serious problem. You don't think it was something that needed to be addressed. And that in no way, shape, or form is what I believe. And I think anything less than that would just be illogical. But to sum it up, 2020, you had a viral agent, COVID, we all remember. And I think the issue becomes what was the response, what should have been done. I think in many ways there was an overreaction to the virus in terms of locking down populations, shutting down the economy, shutting down society, and that was not the way to go. And that in the long term, that was not an effective way of combating the virus.
Things are much clearer in hindsight at the time, and I lived in New York prior to living in Portland, and I had friends there, and people were dying at insane rates, and what was going on. I mean, I had a friend who lived in a building where they were taking out people to the hospital on a daily basis. It was a scary time for a lot of people. I guess I pushed back on the idea that this was something that a response, even if you believe it was an overreaction, was in any way not well intentioned to try to keep as many people alive as possible. I guess my question would be, what were certain people, more I guess Democrats and Democratic run states, what were they supposed to do in a sense of public health? Like, where is the extent to where a sense of like infringing upon obviously personal freedom, because if you can't leave your house, obviously that's infringing on personal freedom, but where is that in the sense of this is a public health crisis? We need to sort of do something for this right now, leading up to when there was a vaccine, obviously. But during that period, like what would you have considered a more rational response?
It's true. Everything's more clear in hindsight. And when you're in the moment, I understand that people want to react in certain ways and react in a way that says, I'm doing something, right? I'm trying to help. And again, we're in total agreement that people died, people were suffering, and that it required some kind of a public health response. I think it comes down to sort of the blanket lockdowns that were implemented. I think those were not an appropriate response to targeting a virus that affected certain groups, right? I think more of a targeted response in terms of, say, retirement homes, nursing homes, New York City, right? I even stated in my book, right? COVID was a New York City retirement home problem, right? This was something that was affecting particular groups in incredibly harmful ways, and we should address that. And when I say New York City, I just mean high population, dense urban areas, right? But was it a national problem? Was it something where, say, Topeka, Kansas, or Bakersfield, California, right? Should they have taken the same exact protocols that, say, the mayor of New York City should have? And so I think a more targeted response, something that didn't affect so many people, was going to be the most optimal.
Well, Republican-run states, famously Kristi Noem, who's now head of DHS, but as governor of South Dakota, she didn't lock down. Ron DeSantis had a different approach. And there was science supporting the idea that different states areas where, as you said, Topeka, Kansas or whatever, could have different responses to it. And I think that did occur. I think the challenge, and I'm interested in your thought on this, but again, the argument from a lot of folks was that um, of a disease that is spreading, to try to protect the most vulnerable would require, say, people like you and I to not spread it, to not make it worse, again, until a vaccine. So things like wearing masks but do you see a common ground like, okay, well, there's no shutdowns, but wear masks or limit some exposure to people who are vulnerable? Like, what could be, again, dealing with a very contagious viral agent?
Right. I think it comes down to trade-offs, right? And the effects of the lockdowns were brutal in many ways, right? And I don't want to lecture you on what those were. I'm sure you're aware. We had suicide rates skyrocketing. We had drug and alcohol abuse skyrocketing. I think there's just a general malaise that infects the population when you lock them inside, when you strip away their jobs, when you tell them they can't go outside and do the regular activities that they enjoy. And so to get back to your main question about, well, what do we do, right? And again, I think that there were cases where lockdowns were imminently necessary, say in an urban area where you have the virus spreading at an alarming rate. The question becomes, how long do we implement those? And I just want to add, there's no question that lockdowns reduce the transmission of infectious disease. You can look at a worldometer graph of new infections, and you can just see the sort of curve of when the lockdowns were implemented and when they were released. I just think that, and again, we may not have common ground here, that the lockdowns were just simply not worth the trade-off in terms of the economic and social harm that they caused.
Well, and what's interesting here, because I was doing some work in Seattle at the time, and Amazon, so this is even before the governor of Washington imposed the lockdown. Amazon said, okay, COVID spreading, people are going to start working from home, which is a private business. It's deciding, it's making its own choice there. Um, Immediately, people in the sort of Amazon campus or area, South Lake Union, like, places were closing because their lunch, they couldn't survive off that lunch rush or whatever. And this is sort of, um, I guess the irony there being that I think that even without government intervention, people making choices like working from home or those offers would have had impacts on livelihood anyway. Do you think that would have been different if it wasn't? And I guess the question, would you have would you have an issue with private industry doing this as opposed to the government? Or do you think it was more severe because it was the government? Like, was your take? Because that was something that was going to happen. I think a lot of places were going to sort of say work from home while we sort this out early on. And they were doing that before the lockdowns.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. And the libertarian in me, it's funny. I come from a libertarian kind of intellectual background, even though I've become very disillusioned with libertarianism in the past few years. But the libertarian in me would say that yes, we should allow private industry to make those decisions on their own, and having the government or a federal authority come in and say, hey, you need to close down, you need to disallow your employees from showing up to work. For me, my instinct is to go, that's incorrect, right? Allow private individuals to make their own decisions. And I think that's a big point about COVID in my book, is allow the private individual to make their own decisions when it comes to responding to the virus. If someone wants to take the vaccine, if someone wants to wear a mask, if someone wants to work from home, allow them to do that 100%. I think you begin to find issues when you have a governmental entity coming in and going, hey, no, you need to lock down, you have to close your business, you have to socially distance. And I think the results were suboptimal if we just allowed communities to handle it as they saw fit.
People of good faith, but if, in a weird way, of different political backgrounds and how they address an issue, which will occur in any case, right? But we're dealing with something as tremendous as a pandemic. How the far right, how the just normal, moderate right, how libertarian, people of libertarian bents, and how who believe in science but are libertarians, and then how the left might respond, it's going to be just very different, and it's going to be a case of perhaps some muddled messaging. Um, was that your experience? Is that your experience, or do you think it was? Um, I find that some people have a sense of that it was a much more sinister top down thing going on, and I just didn't get that. I got a lot of confusion that people were very confused in the moment, but maybe that was me.
It's a great point. When I was first promoting the book, it was funny. The far right loved it because they didn't bother to read the book, but they thought that I was making this case that COVID was fake and that there was a Bill Gates, Dr. Fauci conspiracy to depopulate the planet, and so they thought they would love it, right, and supported it. And then the left, some people on the left, thought I was making the same argument, and so hated it, right. And so of course, the book, in my humble opinion, is more nuanced than that. In no way, shape, or form was this sort of a conspiracy from above to depopulate the earth or to sterilize people. I think all of that is heinously inappropriate, right? And so, but to get to your main point, in that these issues become so polarized, it's sad that the issue of COVID became another right and left issue, and that opening up was associated with Republican governors and closing down was supported by Democratic governors. A main point in my book, we probably disagree here though, is that I think Trump played both sides, right? And I think you had him making comments and public statements that the Chinese reacted beautifully to the virus, even though the Chinese were locking down their population in a way that was scores more stringent than here in the United States. And then he also played the other side that, oh, the lockdowns were bad. So just to get to the main point is that it's sad that almost every issue, including a viral agent, is then politicized, and then we sort of descend into that just no destination point of just arguing with each other and bickering with each other.
Well, yeah, Trump had his own. I mean, he managed that horribly. Had his own sort of agenda, wanting to get reelected. It was kind of responding to whatever in the moment was occurring. I do think where I find that was interesting about this period was um, perhaps sort of, again, the schism between how our elected officials, leaders, what we would expect from them, and the medical community, medical experts. I support the experts. I don't believe, I'm not rejecting the science or whatever, but you know, by their nature, they are going to be more cautious. That based on their training, when they were brought in to sort of kind of make policy, if you listened entirely to that, you're going to get a much more restrictive response. Like, when can I not wear a mask? When can kids go to school? When can this? Whereas teachers, politicians or leaders, if you think of in general, the idea is to take all this information and perhaps make decisions based on some of the stuff you'd mentioned, right? Like, what are some of the trade-offs? Not to say that doctors don't make trade-offs; they do all the time in a moment, but it's a different calculus. What do you think about that as far as sort of the kind of difference in decision making that might have been occurring?
Mm. It's a great point. I think it's a tragedy in that expertise, which is highly valuable, as you hinted at, and that we should trust the experts and we should listen to them when the issue at hand is correlated with their area of expertise, and we'd be foolish not to. I think part of the tragedy in hindsight of COVID-19 and the pandemic is that now people trust experts less than ever, right? And that does not bode well for the country. I think the problem was, and I have no PhDs in epidemiology or virology or anything like that, but I think the issue is that the pandemic and the prescriptions that were applied were affecting facets of our existence that spread way beyond just reducing transmission of COVID-19. We've talked about those trade-offs. This was a problem. This was an issue that intersected with the economy and intersected with culture and society and so many things. And I think in our Republican system, I use Republic as the small letter, right, is that we then ascribe responsibility to elected officials to balance all of those considerations and then come to a solution that incorporates all interested parties. I don't think that was done. like you said, an expert. He sort of sees the world through that kind of pigeonhole of his expertise. The problem was the pandemic infused itself into so many different areas, and we weren't best suited to just listen to one particular expert.
It would seem at the time, so in 2020, I think people sometimes have a more rose-colored view of that because there was sort of a balanced set of like money. I mean, for if you were a business owner, obviously it was tough, but there was like small business loans. There were things keeping everything afloat. It seemed as if 2021 was where things really kind of got tough for folks, both with inflation because you turned the economy back on, things got juiced, and also, and I've written about this, um, the sense that it felt like we were coming out of it, and then we sort of had to withdraw. So um, there was a sense of, oh, we never have to wear masks again. And then there was a variant of the Delta variant. And it's like, okay, well, you can catch it now. The symptoms will be just less severe. You probably should wear a mask. And I felt like that's where a lot of people, even beyond politics, sort of broke as far as like it was just over. I mean, I feel like that's where they talk about COVID fatigue. That's where it sort of really occurred. Where I push back is the idea that everyone was lying to you when they said things, you wouldn't have to wear a mask again at the vaccine. I think they just, it's a novel virus, hence its name, right? And so this changed. That doesn't mean that people were lying to you or you should reject the science. It was just things changed. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, it's just part of that tragedy of now we don't trust the experts at all, right? And I don't think there was any deliberate malice to any of it. Even the leak of, and we disagree on this, but the origins of the virus in China. There's all these people on the far right who believe that the Chinese Communist Party did that deliberately. I don't think so at
Mm,
all. And I think again that's symptomatic of the political climate that we live in, where anything and everything now someone is deliberately doing it. There's sort of a cabal of faceless elites that are pulling the strings on power, when in reality I think everyone's just as sort of clueless as the next person. We're all just trying to figure it out, as you hinted about with the different variants, and then things change and then everyone's reacting on the fly. And so to your other point about the economy and how some of that has been forgotten, I think part of my book and part of what I think we need to emphasize is just how awful things were and just how sort of desperate things became during that time. We can all experience this in our personal lives, but once something's passed, then it's almost impossible to go back and really feel what it was like to be in that situation. But I think we do have to remember, and we do have to remember just how much things were collapsing. And it took $7 trillion of stimulus by the central bank in order to just keep things afloat. So I think it's important to remember that.
well, yeah, I mean, I think the impact of that continued because again, with inflation and other, I mean, that became I mean, we're still coming out of it, right? So like just to try to keep things afloat, and some of that's unavoidable. I mean, and I think there was sort of bipartisan consensus as much as there was that we needed to do something at that time. But um, yeah, I do. But also regarding the vaccine itself, uh, this is something Trump had supported, Operation Warp Speed, and it was interesting at the time. People were mocking him for naming it after a Star Trek thing and thinking there would be a vaccine in the same year. There were New York Times pieces, and everyone's like, "That's ridiculous. We'll never have We'll have a vaccine in 3 or 4 years. You're dreaming, right?" And then when it occurred, it arguably the greatest achievement of his presidency, he then started running away from, and then everyone started fearing vaccines. I was not surprised by that response. Again, RFK Jr., that part of the left had existed, the sort of anti-vax, anti I call anti-science wing. Um, but I would assume, not to assume too much, but again, from a libertarian background, you would had issues probably with vaccine mandates or requiring people to get the vaccine, even if you might have agreed with the vaccine itself. Like, what was your thought about like trying to get sort of full compliance with the vaccine?
Yeah, first and foremost, yeah, vaccines work. And I think if someone wants to take them and someone wants to treat themselves with a vaccine, I think more power to them, and allow them to do that. And again, the whole anti-vaccine contingent that currently dominates our federal government is ill-advised, right, and it does not bode well for the future. Yes, the libertarian in me, sort of the personal choice person in me, would say, hey, allow people to make that choice if they want to. I was in the military at the time. Just a little background on me. I was forcibly made to take the vaccine, something I would not have otherwise done. I feel that I'm 28 now. I feel that as a 28-year-old male with relatively good health, I would say I didn't need it. But again, and I think those compulsions and those mandates, unfortunately, did science a disfavor, right? Because now you have people who are less likely to trust those experts and those scientific advancements, which is a miracle, right? Operation Warp Speed in some ways is a miracle, and people are less inclined to trust that the next time around, which is not a good development.
Well, and I'd heard that from folks about, I'm young and healthy. Why do I need this? I mean, young. If you think about diseases like measles or whatever, young healthy people get vaccinated against it because you don't want to catch that. Even if you could survive it, it is not something that's going to be fun to sort of endure. And young healthy people like yourself, I mean, there are tons of cases of that, were getting COVID pre-vaccine and dying, or having long-term health issues, like people who were as healthy as you are were then, unable to like walk a mile again after it was a serious condition. What would be, again, I can get the argument about not wanting to be forced to take it, but like, as just a precaution, why would you be wary of it, given that people, again, as healthy as you, have had died during the pandemic?
Right. I think you'll probably think I'm a kook here, but again, I think first and foremost, it's a personal choice, and just controlling what goes in and out of your body is paramount to just individual liberty, right? And that's not something that should be mandated by a coercive government, right? I think that's first and foremost my instinct there. Secondly, again, I would want my immune system to be able to battle the virus on its own and overcome it and learn to strengthen itself, right? And I think that's the best defense against any viral agent, as long as it's not Ebola or something like that, or something with a fatality rate of over 50%, right, or something like that. I think allowing people's immune systems, again, not the elderly, not those with pre-existing conditions, but allowing people's immune system to encounter the virus, learn its structure and how it works, and then be able to combat and defend against it the next time around.
Okay, I mean, fair enough. I I'd heard that I have someone who never really got sick, and but people will describe their mild symptoms of it, and it was like, that sounds terrible. I'm like, that's not like, take some Chinese food and watch a movie overnight. That's like being bedridden, and I didn't really want any part of that. But obviously, I get personal choice, though I do think there are vaccine requirements in general, right? For military personnel, it's not just it wasn't just COVID, right?
That's a good point.
So,
Yeah, tons of immunizations. Yeah, we get shot up like crazy.
um, but yes, obviously, personal choice. You're not in the middle. You're not. You're a vet, from what I understand, but not
Mhm.
you're out. You're out, and so are you're. But you're a writer now, or what? May I ask, like, what your focus is now? Is it this book or other things you got going on, or?
Yeah, I got some other things going on, trying to transition, but I am officially out of the military now. I wrote this book. It started last summer. Took me about 9 to 12 months, whatever it was, to get it done, and it was just something I just felt compelled to write about. It was something that was just sort of eating at me, and I think, like you said earlier in the interview, where there's this lack of common understanding, or at least kind of this reflection period that I think needed to occur. It was just mind-boggling to me that something so disruptive, something so destructive, whether it's the virus itself or the response, is just sort of, it's almost like it never happened, right? It just feels to me that no one really wants to talk about it, reflect on it, to reckon with it, right? And so I just felt compelled to put my thoughts down on paper and organize away.
And what's the response been so far? As you said, is it again sort of fallen on this sense of the right loves it without having read it, and then the left immediately thinks you agree with the right? Like, have you had trouble sort of kind of saying it's a bit more nuanced than that?
Absolutely, right, and that was the concern. I remember I was invited on a podcast. I won't say who, and I had an initial phone call, and they wanted to talk about how Anthony Fauci back in the day was sort of a Joseph Mengele type character and was experimenting on children and all of this stuff. And it was really eye opening to encounter that section of the political sphere where it's believe anything, no rationality, just complete partisanship. I think it's symptomatic for a broader trend. I see stuff on X, and it'll be a picture of like tunnels, right? It'll be this picture of tunnels, and the caption will be, Jeffrey Epstein tunnels found. This is confirmed. This is where they traffic children. And then there'll be 1,000 comments supporting it, 10,000 likes, and I just go, it seems like we're descending into a really scary place in terms of the information world.
Yeah. And so once again, thank you for coming on. I think there are, agree or disagree, there are more folks who are sort of perhaps in your line of frame of thought than all the extremists or on either side, or whatever the conventional wisdom is. And I think perhaps it's something that even 5 years later, people are struggle to actually talk about if you aren't in either camp. Because if you have, it's tough, right? You're sort of you you don't want to sort of align yourself perhaps with extremes on either side, so the nuanced discussions aren't happening. So I'm glad that you were willing to come on and try to have this one. And where can people find your book if they want to read sort of your account?
And so on October 2nd, it'll be released on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So in about a month's time, they can find it if they'd like to read it.
All right, Thomas Beckett Kane, The Reckoning. Check that out. Whether you agree or disagree, it's a worthwhile read. And like, share, subscribe. We'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.